The Pendlebogen Training System for Grapevines, Grape Video 13. This presentation assumes a familiarity with the viticultural terminology presented in Grape Videos 1 to 5. The Pendlebogen Training System is called that because Pendle in German means hanging down or pendulant or pendulum hanging down, and Bogan means arch or arc. So it's a hanging down arch. And doesn't this look very much like the umbrella Niffin training system we presented in an earlier video? I sometimes like to call this mini umbrella because it is truly like umbrella Niffin, except everything occurs lower on the trellis. Sometimes a version of this training system has been called Pendleburgen or half arch. It's also called just in English arched cane. And it involves putting canes over a wire and down as seen here. And we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the Pendlebogen training system. Well, one of the advantages, and the first advantage that we're going to talk about, is that it places the fruiting zone and the renewal zone close to the ground. Here's a slide that shows the Pendlebogen training system in the Finger Lakes region of New York. And this is fairly typical, that the canes are arched over a wire that is perhaps 36 inches from the ground, and then back down to a wire that is about 24 inches above the ground. But the height of that arch may vary from place to place and from application to application. Here is an application of Pendlebogen training fairly close to the ground. In the foreground on the right, you can see that Pendlebogen is very close to the ground in this Michigan vineyard. And here's what those vines look like as we approach harvest, with clusters hanging very close to the ground. And the advantage of being near to the ground is that the radiant heat that comes off the ground can create a warmer microclimate than higher on the trellis. Therefore, it can help to hasten the maturity of the fruit. However, there is a limitation to placing fruit near the ground. We're going to say that the advantage of placing fruit near the ground occurs principally when the fruit is around 20 inches above the ground surface. And I say this because there is a fascinating book that discusses in great detail the climate near the ground. That's the name of it. And I'm going to show you the title of this book right now. It's called The Climate Near the Ground by Rudolf Geiger, and it was published in 1957 by Harvard University Press. And of the many things presented in this wonderful, wonderful publication is that the principal advantage of radiant heat off the ground is gained when the fruit is really within about 20 inches of the ground. By the time we get 30 and 40 inches off the ground, then the advantage is not so great. So if you want to read more about this and learn more about radiant heat and maturation of fruit and the advantages that Pendlebogen can offer in that regard, I strongly urge you to get a copy of this publication, and it is just fascinating how much can be described about this topic of radiant heat near the ground. Well, moving on, a second advantage of the Pendlebogen training system is that it spreads the fruiting zone out vertically compared to Guyot training. This is a schematic of Guyot training from one of our earlier videos, and as a refresher you can see that with Guyot training we typically put a cane or canes in two directions along a wire for fruiting. And that limits the fruiting zone to that area right around that particular trellis wire. When we use Pendlebogen, we can spread out the fruiting zone vertically and get less congestion of the fruit vertically because of the arched cane effect of Pendlebogen training. Well, a third advantage is that not only can we spread out nodes vertically better with Pendlebogen than with guillot training, we can display more nodes per foot of trellis than with guillot training. And that can be quite important as we gain vine size and want to increase our fruiting capacity. We can do it with even more than 2 canes. We can add 2 canes on each side, something like this, to increase our nodes per foot of row to increase fruiting with Pendlebogen relative to guillot. So that's a major advantage. Here we've taken the nodes on half of that schematic of a Pendlebogen trained vine, and you can see that we can add many more shoots per foot of row. Of course, ideally, we don't want too many. We would be aiming for something like 5 shoots per foot of trellis to get an ideal shoot density. And we can do that with Pendlebogen more reliably than with guillot. If we go back to this photo, which I showed you earlier, you can see on the left side of the vine that there are 2 canes arched over the wires to form the Pendlebogen training system, and there's just one on the right. But that has allowed the grower to put more shoots per foot of row along the trellis than would have been possible with guillot training. Well, a fourth advantage is that the Pendlebogen training system reduces the impact of shoot apical dominance. And we talked about apical dominance and what it is and how it's controlled by this arched cane or umbrella system that we talked about in a previous video. So we're not going to talk about that over and over again. You can refer back to the video on umbrella niffin training. But just to say that just like with umbrella niffin training, apical dominance of the shoots out at the ends of canes is reduced by arching them over a wire with umbrella niffin. The same is true with Pendlebogen. Here again, in the schematic as we have it, we have very easily, thanks to computer graphics, shown rather uniform development of shoots all along the cane because of the way we arched this over the wire. In this photo, you can see vines with arching canes over the wires fairly close to the ground. And you can get a general picture of how all the canes on this vine are fairly well developed and nice, long canes. And there really isn't a dominance of the canes out on the ends or in the middle of the vine. But the overall growth of canes further back in the middle are just as nice and as long as those out on the end. So Pendlebogen does help minimize apical dominance of shoot growth. Well, yes, there are also disadvantages to the Pendlebogen training system, so let's discuss those. First of all, it is a long cane pruning and tying training system. It requires pruning out long canes and tying them back on the trellis every year, something that isn't necessary when you have a cordon system and spur pruning. So it involves considerably more work in the spring to prune out long canes and then tie them back onto the trellis than if you had a training system that utilized cordons and spur pruning. Well, a second disadvantage of Pendleburgen training is that the low fruit and renewal zones make it difficult to prune and harvest. Oh, yes, it does. Here's another photo showing fruit near the ground with Pendleburgen training. I can tell you that the crew that was pruning out the canes to tie them on this low ground was not happy with that task, and they were especially not happy when picking this fruit at harvest time. I heard a lot of complaints about aching backs and so forth. So if you get stuff really close to the ground, it's going to be a challenge to perform the tasks of pruning, harvest, and everything else in between with such a low training system. Well, a third disadvantage of Pendleburgen training is that if the fruit is very close to the ground, it can promote fruit rot. Going back to this photo, when we conducted trials of Pendleburgen training, we found that in the fall, not only did the fruit ripen faster when it was placed closer to the ground, but it actually ripened and rotted faster also. And I think that had to do with the heavy dews that form late in the growing season in southwest Michigan. And this fruit would lie wet on those late days in August and September and October much longer than the fruit up higher on the vine. So we would have wetting periods for botrytis and other fruit rots to develop on the fruit when it was placed extremely close to the ground, and that was a disappointment to us. We ultimately stopped working on training vines very close to the ground for this purpose. We were impressed with the radiant heat, but very discouraged about the fruit rot that developed on the fruit. Well, that's it, folks. That's the Pendleburgen training system, and let us summarize the advantages and disadvantages of this training system. Under advantages, we have that the fruit zone and renewal zone are close to the ground. That's an advantage of sorts. If you get it just right, about 20 inches above the ground, you will tend to advance the maturity of fruit because of radiant heat from the ground. Secondly, it spreads the fruit zone out vertically compared to the Guyot training system. It can display more nodes per foot of trellis than the Guyot training system, and this is especially important as vine size gets larger. And 4, it reduces the impact of shoot apical dominance, as we discussed at length in our video on umbrella niffin training. Under disadvantages, long cane pruning and tying makes for extra work in the spring compared to cordon training systems. Low fruit and renewal zones makes it difficult to prune and harvest. It's hard to work that low on the trellis without getting a backache, folks. And if the fruit zone is very close to the ground, it can promote fruit rot, and indeed, we had that happen to us repeatedly in our trials. Well, that's it about Pendlebogen training. In our next video, we're going to talk about Keuka high renewal training. And I'm going to take you on a travel log to that very special lake in the Finger Lakes of New York, Keuka Lake. So until then, happy grape growing.